March 25th, 1586, York, England. The morning mist clings to the cobblestones as Margaret Clitheroe, a 33-year-old mother of three, is dragged from her cell toward what will become one of the most documented and horrifying executions in English legal history. But Margaret doesn't know that in exactly 15 minutes, she will experience a death so brutal that even the hardened executioner will vomit before it's over. She doesn't know that her ribs will crack one by one like branches snapping in a winter storm. She doesn't know that her lungs will slowly collapse as 800 pounds of stone systematically crushes every bone in her chest. And she certainly doesn't know that 437 years later, we would still be talking about her scream. Dr. William Harrison, the court physician forced to monitor Margaret's vital signs during her execution, later wrote in his private journal, "The prisoner remained conscious for the entirety of the pressing. Her eyes bulged from their sockets as the weight increased. Blood frothed from her mouth by the 7th minute. By the 10th minute, I could hear her ribs snapping like dry kindling. She attempted to speak until the 13th minute, when her chest cavity could no longer expand enough to draw breath. Death came at the 15th minute and 37 seconds, not from the crushing weight, but from drowning in her own blood. Margaret Clitheroe's crime, hiding Catholic priests in her home during the Protestant Reformation. Her punishment, peine forte à dure, being pressed to death under increasing weights until she either confessed her guilt or died. The English legal system had calculated that this method would extract confessions from the most stubborn defendants. What they hadn't calculated was that some people would choose an agonizing death over betraying their faith. But here's what makes Margaret's execution truly shocking. It wasn't unusual. In the 16th century, this was just Tuesday. Across Europe, an estimated 100,000 people were executed between 1500 and 1600 using methods so horrific that modern forensic experts struggled to understand how the human body could endure such systematic destruction. We're talking about an era where torture wasn't just legal, it was profitable. Executioners charged different rates for different methods. A quick beheading cost more than a slow burning. A clean hanging was premium pricing compared to being drawn and quartered. What you're about to learn isn't just history, it's a journey into the darkest capabilities of human cruelty. Over the next 90 minutes, I'm going to reveal torture methods so sophisticated that they required engineering degrees to construct, so psychologically devastating that they broke minds before bodies, and so publicly celebrated that entire families would travel for days to witness them. You think you know about medieval brutality from movies and television? You know nothing. Hollywood actually sanitizes these historical realities because the truth is disturbing for mainstream audiences. The real methods were worse, much worse than anything Hollywood has dared to show. We're talking about punishments that could keep someone conscious and screaming for days, techniques that turned human execution into theatrical performances, and torture devices so intricate they were considered works of art. I'm going to show you the breaking wheel that could stretch a person's death across 4 days of public agony. I'll reveal the Spanish water torture that made prisoners beg to be burned alive instead. You'll learn about the Iron Maiden that wasn't designed to kill quickly, but to pierce victims at precisely calculated points to maximize suffering while preventing immediate death. And if you stay until the end, I'll reveal which of these medieval torture methods is still secretly practiced in certain parts of the world today, hidden from international law and human rights observers. But first, let me ask you something. Do you think you could survive what Margaret Clitheroe experienced? Do you think you could remain conscious as your ribcage collapsed inward, as your lungs filled with blood, as every breath became a struggle against 800 pounds of crushing stone? Do you think you could maintain your dignity while hundreds of strangers watched you die for their entertainment? The answer is no. You couldn't survive it. None of us could. Because these punishments weren't designed for survival, they were designed to break the human spirit so completely that the fear alone would keep entire populations in line. They were designed to create a terror so profound that people would confess to crimes they never committed, betray friends and family, and abandon their deepest beliefs just to avoid experiencing what you're about to learn. Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, After witnessing multiple burnings at the stake in 1556, I have seen grown men weep at the mere sight of the stake being prepared. The sound of wood being stacked, the smell of oil being poured, the sight of chains being tested, these alone have extracted more confessions than any interrogation. The anticipation of agony is often more powerful than agony itself. The 16th century didn't just punish crimes, it choreographed human suffering into public theater. Every execution was a performance, every torture device was a prop, and every scream was part of a symphony designed to reinforce the absolute power of church and state. Executioners weren't just killers. They were artists who took pride in their craft, competed for contracts, and innovated new methods the way modern inventors developed technology. What makes this even more disturbing is how normal it all seemed to the people living through it. Children grew up watching public burnings like we attend sporting events. Merchants planned their market days around scheduled executions because crowds meant customers. Young couples would plan their wedding dates to avoid conflicts with major torture spectacles because everyone in town would be at the square watching someone die. So settle in, because what you're about to experience will fundamentally change how you understand human nature, historical justice, and the thin line between civilization and barbarism. Margaret Clitheroe's 15-minute death was just the beginning of a story that will take us through the darkest chapter of European legal history, a time when the law itself became the ultimate instrument of terror. And remember, every method I'm about to describe was legal. Every torture device was blessed by religious authorities. Every scream was considered the sound of justice being served. This wasn't chaos or madness, this was order, implemented with the precision of medieval engineering and the blessing of divine authority. Are you ready to learn what human beings are truly capable of when power becomes absolute and mercy becomes weakness? Are you prepared to understand why the phrase cruel and unusual punishment exists in modern legal code? Because once you hear these stories, once you understand these methods, you'll never again take your freedom or your life for granted. Let's begin with the system that made it all possible. The medieval justice apparatus that turned human suffering into legal procedure and transformed execution into entertainment. Because before we can understand the horrors that awaited the condemned, we need to understand the minds that created them. The medieval justice system, engineering human suffering to understand the grotesque punishments of the 16th century. You must first understand that they weren't the products of chaos or madness. They were the result of a carefully constructed legal system that had spent centuries perfecting the art of human suffering. This wasn't random violence. This was systematic, methodical, and terrifyingly efficient brutality implemented with the same precision that built cathedrals and conquered continents. The medieval mind operated on fundamentally different principles from our modern understanding of justice. Where we seek rehabilitation and proportionate punishment, they sought deterrence through terror and public demonstration of absolute authority. The goal wasn't to reform criminals. It was to create examples so horrifying that potential lawbreakers would be paralyzed by fear before they could act. The economics of execution. Medieval justice wasn't just about punishment, it was a thriving industry. Professional executioners formed guilds, charged standardized rates, and competed for lucrative contracts. A master executioner in 16th century Paris could earn more in a single day of public executions than a skilled craftsman made in a month. They invested in specialized tools, traveled between cities for major events, and trained apprentices in the precise techniques required for each type of death. Consider the case of Franz Schmidt, master executioner of Nuremberg from 1573 to 1617. Schmidt kept meticulous records of his 361 executions and 345 lesser punishments, documenting not just names and crimes, but detailed accounts of methods, crowd reactions, and technical difficulties. His journals reveal a man who approached human suffering with the same professional dedication that a surgeon approaches healing. He tested new techniques, refined existing methods, and took genuine pride in delivering death with maximum public impact. Schmidt's records show us that executioners weren't crude butchers, but highly trained specialists who understood anatomy, psychology, and crowd dynamics. They knew exactly where to place the first cut to ensure maximum bleeding without immediate death. They understood which bones to break first to create the most spectacular screams. They could calculate down to the minute how long each torture method would keep a victim conscious and responsive. From Franz Schmidt's execution diary, entry dated August 15, 1584, Hans Ferschel, horse thief, age 26, hanged at dawn before crowd of approximately 3,000. Rope broke on first attempt, crowd cheered. Second rope held but not slipped, causing slow strangulation rather than quick neck break. Subject remained conscious for 4 minutes, 30 seconds, providing excellent deterrent effect. Note, commissioned new ropes from Munich supplier Local Hemp, proving unreliable for heavier subjects. The medieval justice system also recognized different categories of criminals, each requiring different levels of spectacular punishment. Petty thieves might face branding or pillory, humiliating, but not fatal. Political rebels faced drawing and quartering a death so horrific it would discourage future uprisings. Religious heretics were burned alive, their souls purified through fire, while their bodies served as warnings to other would-be blasphemers. But perhaps most chilling was how the system incorporated mercy as another form of cruelty. Condemned prisoners could sometimes purchase merciful deaths by paying executioners for quicker methods. A bribe might earn you a sharp sword instead of a dull axe, or a quick beheading instead of slow burning. This created a horrifying marketplace where the wealthy could literally buy their way out of the most extreme suffering, while the poor faced maximum agony. The legal procedures surrounding torture and execution were as elaborate as the punishments themselves. Courts employed specialized torturers called questioners, who were trained to extract confessions without causing permanent damage that might interfere with subsequent public execution. These men understood the human pain threshold with scientific precision, knowing exactly how much agony they could inflict while keeping their subjects conscious and coherent. The psychological sophistication of medieval torture is perhaps its most disturbing aspect. Executioners understood that the mind could be broken more easily than the body, and they developed techniques that attacked both simultaneously. They would describe in graphic detail exactly what was going to happen to their victims, sometimes days or weeks in advance. This anticipatory torture often proved more effective than any physical pain in extracting confessions or information. Consider the case of the Inquisition's treatment of suspected heretics. The Spanish Inquisition didn't just torture bodies, they tortured entire families. Children were forced to watch their parents being stretched on the rack. Spouses were made to witness each other's slow dismemberment. Parents were compelled to choose which of their children would face torture first. This psychological warfare often broke resistance more completely than any physical punishment could achieve. The medieval justice system also understood the power of anticipation in crowd control. Public executions weren't scheduled randomly. They were carefully timed for maximum social impact. Major executions coincided with market days, religious festivals, or political celebrations, ensuring the largest possible audiences. The more people who witness spectacular punishment, the more effective the deterrent effect throughout the broader population. Regional variations in medieval justice. Different European kingdoms developed signature torture methods that reflected their unique cultural values and political needs. German states perfected breaking wheels and iron maidens. Spanish territories pioneered auto-da-fe burning ceremonies. French courts specialized in elaborate drawing and quartering spectacles. English authorities developed their own forms of pressing and hanging. These weren't just different ways to kill, they were expressions of national identity through systematic cruelty. The training of medieval executioners reveals the systematic nature of this brutality. Master executioners took apprentices who spent years learning the precise techniques required for each punishment. They studied anatomy to understand which wounds were immediately fatal versus those that would prolong suffering. They learned crowd psychology to gauge when audiences were becoming bored versus when they were properly terrified. They practiced on condemned criminals, refining their techniques until they could deliver death with the same precision that master craftsmen created art. Perhaps most disturbing of all, was the religious justification that permeated the entire system. Medieval authorities genuinely believed they were saving souls through the systematic destruction of bodies. Torture wasn't seen as cruel. It was seen as merciful, giving sinners one final chance to confess and achieve salvation before facing eternal damnation. The more painful the earthly punishment, the more likely the condemned would achieve spiritual purification. This religious framework meant that some of the most horrific tortures were administered by clergy who saw themselves as healers of souls rather than destroyers of flesh. Inquisitors who ordered suspects to be stretched on racks or burned with hot irons genuinely believed they were performing acts of divine mercy. The screams of the tortured weren't sounds of injustice, they were the music of salvation being achieved through suffering. Tomás de Torquemada, Grand Inquisitor of Spain, in a letter to Pope Innocent VIII, 1487, the cries of the penitent under examination are not sounds of injustice, but songs of purification. Each application of heated iron brings the sinner closer to confession and thus to salvation. We cause pain to prevent eternal agony. We destroy flesh to save souls. This is not cruelty. This is divine mercy expressed through necessary suffering. The medieval justice system also incorporated elements of theater and performance that transformed executions into elaborate public rituals. Condemned prisoners were dressed in specific costumes that identified their crimes. Religious heretics wore yellow robes marked with flames. Thieves were adorned with signs listing their stolen goods. Adulterers might be stripped naked or forced to wear symbols of their shame. These costume elements weren't just identification. They were part of a carefully choreographed performance designed to educate audiences about the consequences of specific sins. The timing and pacing of executions followed theatrical principles as well. A skilled executioner could stretch a single death across hours, building tension and maintaining audience engagement through carefully managed escalation of suffering. They understood how to create climactic moments that would maximize emotional impact, when to pause for dramatic effect, and how to deliver the final death blow at precisely the moment when crowd excitement reached its peak. This systematic approach to human suffering created a feedback loop that continuously escalated the brutality of medieval justice. As audiences became accustomed to certain levels of violence, executioners had to develop new methods to maintain the shock value that made their punishments effective deterrents. Innovation in torture techniques followed the same patterns as innovation in any other medieval craft: continuous refinement, professional competition, and the pursuit of ever greater technical sophistication. Now that we understand the system that made such horrors possible, we can begin to examine the specific methods that medieval authorities used to transform human beings into public spectacles of suffering. Each punishment method we'll explore was the product of centuries of refinement, the work of professional specialists, and the expression of a legal philosophy that saw terror as the highest form of justice. Prepare yourself, because what follows will challenge everything you thought you knew about human civilization and the thin line between order and savagery. Public humiliation. The theater of shame before medieval authorities destroyed bodies, they destroyed dignity. Public humiliation wasn't just a punishment. It was a carefully orchestrated assault on human identity designed to transform respected community members into objects of ridicule and contempt. These methods were considered merciful because they didn't typically result in death, but survivors often found that the psychological scars lasted far longer than any physical wound could. The pillory stands as perhaps the most deceptively simple, yet psychologically devastating instrument of medieval justice. At first glance, it appears almost benign, a wooden frame with holes for the head and hands, positioned in the town square where the condemned would stand for a prescribed period. But this apparent simplicity concealed a horror that could break the strongest mind through systematic humiliation and crowd-sanctioned violence. The anatomy of pillory torture, the wooden frame wasn't randomly constructed. Medieval carpenters built pillories with specific dimensions designed to maximize discomfort and vulnerability. The neck hole was sized to prevent comfortable positioning while ensuring the victim couldn't escape. The hand holes were positioned to force an unnatural arm position that would become excruciating after the first hour. The height was calculated to make the condemned visible to the maximum number of spectators while preventing any possibility of rest or relief. Consider the case of William Prynne, the English Puritan lawyer who was sentenced to the pillory in 1637 for publishing pamphlets critical of the monarchy. Prynne's ordeal lasted 6 hours, during which he was subjected to what contemporary accounts describe as the fury of an unleashed mob. Spectators threw not just rotten food and stones, but burning coals, dead rats, and human excrement. By the 3rd hour, Prynne's face was so battered and swollen that witnesses couldn't recognize him. By the 6th hour, he had lost consciousness 3 times from pain and blood loss. But Prynne's physical suffering was only part of his punishment. The psychological destruction was far more complete. As a respected lawyer and scholar, he had built his identity around intellectual dignity and moral authority. The pillory stripped away these intangible assets more completely than any physical torture could have. When he was finally released, Prynne discovered that his social existence had been erased. Former friends crossed the street to avoid him. Professional colleagues refused to acknowledge his presence. His career, reputation, and place in society had been destroyed more thoroughly than if he had simply been executed. From the diary of Samuel Pepys witnessing a pillory punishment in London, 1664. Saw today a wretch in the pillory near Charing Cross. The mob showed no mercy, pelting him with stones until his face ran red. A woman threw the contents of her chamber pot at his head while children laughed and clapped. Most disturbing was not the man's cries, but his silence after the 2nd hour. He had retreated so far into himself that he seemed no longer present in his own body. This is how we destroy a man without killing him. The stocks presented a variation on pillory torture that focused on different forms of vulnerability and humiliation. While the pillory restrained head and hands, stocks secured the feet and ankles, forcing victims into a seated position that made them easy targets for crowd abuse while preventing any possibility of maintaining dignity through upright posture. Medieval authorities understood that forcing someone into a submissive physical position would accelerate their psychological breakdown. The case of Mary Mudge, a tavern keeper convicted of serving watered ale in Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1656, illustrates how stocks could transform minor commercial fraud into a life-destroying ordeal. Mudge spent 12 hours in the stocks during the town's busiest market day, ensuring maximum exposure to the community whose trust she had violated. Customers whom she had served for years took turns abusing her, some throwing spoiled food, others simply standing close enough to spit in her face while reciting her crimes. What made Mudge's punishment particularly cruel was the involvement of children. Parents brought their offspring to witness the punishment as a moral lesson, encouraging them to participate in the humiliation as part of their education about justice and consequences. Children as young as 6 threw stones at Mudge while their parents applauded. The psychological impact of being tormented by children, people she had probably served sweets to in her tavern, completed her social destruction more thoroughly than any adult violence could have achieved. The ducking stool represented medieval ingenuity in combining physical torture with public humiliation while maintaining the pretense of merciful punishment. Designed primarily for women accused of being scolded, speaking too boldly, or criticizing male authority, the ducking stool transformed the basic human need for air into an instrument of social control and public entertainment. The device itself was a marvel of medieval engineering designed specifically to maximize suffering while maintaining plausible deniability about intent to kill. A large wooden chair was mounted on the end of a long lever arm, allowing operators to control the speed and duration of each submersion. By systematically destroying these connections through public humiliation, they could inflict damage that exceeded any physical torture. Consider the punishment of rough music or charivari community, organized humiliation campaigns that could last for months. When someone violated social norms, adultery, domestic violence, or other moral transgressions, the entire community would participate in systematic harassment designed to drive the offender away. Groups would gather outside the transgressor's home at night, banging pots and pans, shouting insults, and preventing sleep. They would follow the person through streets, interrupting any attempt at normal social interaction. The case of Thomas and Margaret Harrison, accused of adultery in a Yorkshire village in 1598, shows how charivari could escalate into a form of psychological terrorism that destroyed entire families. The community harassment campaign lasted 7 months, during which the Harrisons were subjected to nightly noise campaigns, had their property vandalized, found dead animals placed on their doorstep, and were followed by groups of children who would throw mud and chant rhymes about their supposed sins. The Harrison children suffered perhaps the worst consequences. They were excluded from community activities, refused service in shops, and tormented by other children who had learned from their parents that the Harrison family was shameful. The 3 Harrison children eventually developed what modern psychology would recognize as severe anxiety disorders, refusing to leave their home even after the formal harassment campaign ended. The long-term social effects of public humiliation punishments extended far beyond the immediate victims. Communities that participated in these rituals of collective cruelty found their social fabric permanently altered. The shared experience of destroying another human being's dignity created bonds among the participants while establishing clear boundaries about acceptable behavior. Everyone understood that stepping outside community norms could result in total social annihilation. These humiliation punishments also served as training grounds for more severe forms of collective violence. Communities that learned to dehumanize individuals through systematic shame campaigns were well prepared to participate in torture and execution spectacles when more serious crimes required ultimate punishment. The skills needed to mock a person in the pillory, the ability to see another human being as an object deserving abuse, were the same skills needed to cheer for someone being burned alive or torn apart by horses. As we'll see in the next section, medieval authorities had developed an entire spectrum of permanent physical punishments that combined the social destruction of humiliation with the lasting bodily damage that would serve as permanent reminders of transgression. These weren't just punishments, they were ways of turning human bodies into living advertisements for the absolute power of law and order. Branding and mutilation. Marking bodies, destroying lives. Medieval justice didn't just punish crimes, it permanently marked criminals, transforming human bodies into living billboards that advertised transgression for the rest of the condemned person's life. Branding and mutilation served multiple purposes. They provided immediate, painful punishment, created permanent identification of criminal status, and ensured that rehabilitation or reintegration into society would be virtually impossible. These punishments turned human flesh into legal documents that could never be erased or amended. The technology of medieval branding was far more sophisticated than most people realize. Professional executioners didn't simply heat iron rods and press them into flesh. They developed specialized tools and techniques designed to create marks that would remain clearly visible and readable for decades. Different crimes required different brands, applied to specific parts of the body according to legal codes that varied. Fletcher received 2 brands in A on each cheek administered in front of the entire community during Sunday services. The religious context was deliberate. Authorities wanted to emphasize that her sin was not just against her husband, but against God and the moral order of the community. Fletcher's post-branding life became a study in social death while physically alive. Her husband divorced her immediately, as the brands provided legal grounds for dissolution of marriage. Her children were taken away and given to other families as she was deemed unfit for maternal responsibilities. She was refused service in shops, denied accommodation in taverns, and excluded from church services. Within 6 months, Fletcher had been forced to leave the community entirely, becoming a wandering outcast who survived through begging and charity. Medieval mutilation punishments escalated beyond branding to include the systematic removal of body parts that corresponded symbolically to specific crimes. Thieves lost hands that had stolen property. Perjurers had tongues removed that had spoken false oaths. Adulterers suffered genital mutilation that matched their sexual transgressions. These punishments followed a logic of proportional justice that seemed reasonable to medieval minds, but strikes modern sensibilities as barbarically cruel. The amputation of hands for theft was perhaps the most common form of medieval mutilation, practiced across Europe with variations in technique, but consistency in outcome. The procedure wasn't performed randomly. Medieval law specified exactly which hand should be removed, usually the right, as it was considered the primary tool of criminal action. What instruments should be used, and what steps should be taken to prevent immediate death from blood loss. Master executioners developed specialized techniques for hand amputation that balanced several competing goals. The punishment had to be sufficiently painful to serve as deterrent. The amputation had to be complete enough to prevent future theft. But the victim had to survive to serve as a living example to others. This required considerable surgical skill, as poorly performed amputations could result in fatal bleeding or infections that would rob the punishment of its demonstrative value. The case of Jacques Bonhomme, a French peasant who lost his right hand for stealing grain during the famine of 1573, illustrates both the technical sophistication and casual cruelty of medieval mutilation. Bonham's amputation was performed by Master Henry Dubois, the royal executioner of Rouen, using a specially designed cleaver that could sever the hand with a single blow while minimizing blood loss. Technical aspects of medieval hand amputation. The condemned person's arm was placed on a wooden block with the wrist positioned over a groove designed to catch blood. A leather tourniquet was applied to the forearm to reduce bleeding. The executioner used a heavy cleaver or axe to sever the hand with a single decisive blow, aiming for the joint between the wrist bones to ensure clean separation. Immediately after amputation, the stump was plunged into boiling oil or pitch to cauterize the wound and prevent fatal blood loss. Bonham's ordeal didn't end with the physical amputation. The severed hand was nailed to the door of the granary from which he had stolen grain, where it remained as a warning to other potential thieves until it decomposed months later. Bonham himself faced the challenge of surviving as a one-handed peasant in a society that depended on manual labor for basic subsistence. Unable to perform agricultural work effectively, he was forced into begging, which ironically made him more likely to commit future crimes out of desperation. The psychological impact of hand amputation often exceeded the physical trauma. Medieval people understood their bodies as integrated wholes, and the loss of a limb was experienced not just as disability, but as fundamental damage to personal identity. Many amputation victims reported feeling that they were no longer complete human beings, that their bodies had become permanent monuments to their shame and failure. From the confession of Pierre Villain, French thief, after hand amputation in 1544, "I wake each morning and reach for my cup with the hand that is no longer there. I dream of my fingers, feel them moving in sleep, then wake to find only empty air." The executioner took more than my hand. He took my ability to forget my crime. Every task I cannot complete, every tool I cannot hold, every simple action that now requires struggle, reminds me that I am marked as a thief forever. Tongue removal represented one of the most psychologically devastating forms of medieval mutilation, as it attacked the fundamental human capacity for communication while creating permanent physical disability. This punishment was typically reserved for crimes involving speech perjury, blasphemy, sedition, or spreading rumors that threatened social order. The symbolic justice was clear. Mouths that spoke forbidden words would be silenced forever. The technical challenge of tongue removal lay in extracting enough tissue to prevent clear speech while keeping the victim alive and able to eat. Medieval executioners developed several methods, ranging from complete removal of the tongue at its root to partial amputation that left just enough tissue for basic swallowing functions. The choice of method often depended on the severity of the verbal crime and the social status of the condemned person. The case of Brother Marcus of Heidelberg, a Franciscan monk whose tongue was removed for preaching heretical doctrines in 1524, demonstrates how tongue amputation could destroy not just an individual, but an entire intellectual and spiritual career. Brother Marcus had been one of the most eloquent preachers in the German territories, drawing crowds of thousands to hear his sermons about church reform and social justice. His tongue removal was performed using heated iron tongs that gripped the organ and pulled it from his mouth while searing the wound to prevent bleeding. The procedure took nearly 10 minutes, during which Brother Marcus remained conscious and aware of exactly what was being taken from him. When it was over, he had lost not just his ability to speak clearly, but his entire reason for existence as a religious teacher and intellectual leader. The aftermath of Brother Marcus's mutilation reveals the broader social implications of tongue removal. Unable to preach or teach, he was effectively expelled from the religious community that had defined his identity. His attempts to communicate through writing were hampered by the constant pain and infection in his mouth, which made concentration difficult. Within 2 years, the man who had once commanded audiences of thousands had become a silent, forgotten figure whose intellectual gifts had been permanently erased by surgical precision. Medieval authorities also developed forms of mutilation specifically designed for sexual crimes, reflecting the era's complex attitudes toward sexuality and bodily integrity. Adultery, rape, and other sexual transgressions were punished through genital mutilation that served both as proportional justice and as permanent prevention of future sexual crimes. These punishments were considered so intimate and shameful that they were often performed in private rather than as public spectacles. The castration of men convicted of rape or adultery followed procedures that had been refined over centuries of practice. Medieval executioners understood that complete removal of male genitalia carried a high risk of fatal bleeding or infection, so they developed techniques that preserved life while eliminating sexual function. The psychological impact of castration often proved more devastating than the physical trauma, as it attacked fundamental concepts of masculine identity and social role. Female genital mutilation for sexual crimes followed different patterns but achieved similar goals of punishment, prevention, and social marking. Women convicted of adultery or prostitution might face procedures that damage their reproductive capacity while leaving them alive to serve as warnings to others. These punishments were typically performed by female executioners or midwives, as medieval social conventions prohibited male authorities from directly handling women's bodies in such intimate ways. The long-term social consequences of sexual mutilation extended beyond the immediate victims to affect entire family lines. Children of mutilated parents often faced discrimination and social exclusion, as medieval communities viewed sexual crimes as hereditary taints that could be passed down through generations. Marriage prospects for these children were severely limited, and they frequently faced assumptions about their own moral character based on their parents' punishments. The economic impact of mutilation punishments created additional layers of suffering that extended far beyond the initial physical trauma. Medieval society depended heavily on manual labor and skilled craftsmanship, so the loss of hands, eyes, or other body parts often meant complete economic devastation for both the victim and their family. A mutilated craftsman couldn't practice his trade, a branded merchant couldn't conduct business on trust, and a mute teacher couldn't earn a living through instruction. This economic destruction was entirely intentional. Medieval authorities understood that making crime economically devastating would deter potential lawbreakers more effectively than any threat of physical pain. A thief might be willing to risk a beating, but the prospect of losing the hand that earned his livelihood created a much more powerful deterrent effect. The punishment extended beyond the individual to threaten the economic security of entire families who depended on the potential criminal's labor and income. As we'll see in our next section, when medieval authorities wanted to move beyond permanent marking and economic destruction to complete elimination of threats to social order, they had developed execution methods that transformed death itself into elaborate public theater designed to educate, entertain, and terrify entire populations into submission. Execution spectacles. Death as public theater medieval execution wasn't simply about ending lives. It was about transforming death into the ultimate form of public entertainment, while delivering unmistakable messages about power, justice, and the consequences of challenging authority. These weren't quick, private killings, but elaborate theatrical productions that could last for hours and draw audiences larger than most modern sporting events. Every aspect was carefully choreographed to maximize both the condemned person's suffering and the crowd's engagement with the spectacle of state-sanctioned violence. The execution of Guy Fawkes and his fellow gunpowder plot conspirators in 1606 represents perhaps the most thoroughly documented example of execution as public theater in English history. The authorities had nearly a year to plan this event, and they used every moment to create a spectacle that would be remembered for generations. The execution wasn't just punishment for attempted regicide. It was a carefully orchestrated demonstration of royal power that combined religious ceremony, political propaganda, and sadistic entertainment into a single unforgettable performance. The choreography of public execution. Medieval authorities understood that successful execution spectacles required the same careful planning as any major public event. Sites had to be selected for optimal crowd capacity and sightline. Scaffolds had to be constructed with precise dimensions to ensure visibility while preventing collapse under the weight of spectators. Security forces had to be positioned to maintain order while allowing maximum participation in the violence. Timing had to be calculated to maximize attendance while ensuring completion before nightfall. The procession that brought Fawkes and his companions from the Tower of London to the execution ground at Westminster was itself a major component of the theatrical performance. The condemned men were loaded onto wooden hurdles, rough sledges that dragged them through the streets while exposing them to crowd abuse and preventing any possibility of maintaining dignity during their final journey. The route was carefully planned to pass through the most densely populated areas of London, ensuring maximum exposure to the King's justice. Contemporary accounts describe crowds of over 30,000 people lining the streets to witness the procession. Spectators threw rotting food, stones, and human waste at the condemned men while shouting curses and prayers. Children were lifted onto shoulders to get better views of the traitors who had tried to destroy Parliament and kill the king. The journey that would normally take 30 minutes was stretched to nearly 3 hours, allowing everyone in London to participate in the preliminary humiliation before the main execution event. When the procession finally reached Westminster, the condemned men found a scaffold that had been constructed with theatrical precision. The platform was elevated 12 feet above ground level, ensuring visibility from great distances while symbolically raising the execution closer to heaven where divine judgment awaited. The scaffold was surrounded by seating areas for nobles and dignitaries who had paid premium prices for the best views of the upcoming spectacle. From the diary of Sir Arthur Wynne, who witnessed the gunpowder plot executions, "Never have I seen such crowds gathered for any purpose." The very air seemed to vibrate with anticipation of violence. Ladies of quality sat beside common merchants, all equally eager to witness treason receive its due punishment. When the first man was cut down from hanging while still alive, the roar of approval was so loud that windows rattled in buildings half a mile distant. This was not mere justice. This was the entire nation participating in righteous vengeance. The execution method chosen for the gunpowder plot conspirators' hanging, drawing, and quartering represented the pinnacle of medieval execution theater. This wasn't a single act of killing, but a carefully choreographed sequence of tortures designed to provide multiple climactic moments while ensuring maximum suffering for the condemned and maximum entertainment for the audience. Each stage of the punishment served specific symbolic and practical purposes that had been refined over centuries of public execution. The hanging portion began the spectacle but was carefully controlled to prevent quick death. The ropes were positioned and the drop calculated to cause strangulation rather than neck breaking, ensuring that victims would remain conscious for the subsequent stages of their punishment. Executioners monitored the condemned men's condition carefully, cutting them down at precisely the moment when continued hanging would cause death, But not a moment sooner. Guy Fawkes, whose name has become synonymous with the plot, was the last to be executed, allowing him to witness the complete destruction of his fellow conspirators before facing his own death. Contemporary accounts describe how he watched 3 men be disemboweled while still alive, their intestines burned in front of their eyes, their bodies dismembered with surgical precision, while crowds cheered each cut. By the time his own turn came, Fawkes had been psychologically destroyed by watching exactly what awaited him. The disembowelment phase of drawing and quartering required the highest level of executioner skill and provided the most dramatic moments for audience entertainment. The condemned man's abdomen was cut open with surgical precision, and his intestines were slowly extracted while he remained conscious and aware. This required considerable anatomical knowledge to avoid cutting vital organs that would cause immediate death and end a performance prematurely. The technical precision of drawing and quartering. Master executioners trained for years to perfect the surgical skills required for public disembowelment. They had to understand human anatomy well enough to extract organs without causing immediate death, strong enough to perform the physical labor of dismemberment, and experienced enough to pace the procedure for maximum audience engagement. The best executioners could keep a victim conscious and responsive throughout the entire drawing process, which could last up to an hour. The intestines removed during disembowelment weren't simply discarded, they were burned in braziers positioned around the scaffold while the victim watched. This burning served multiple symbolic purposes. It represented the purification of treason through fire, provided visual and olfactory drama for the audience, and created additional psychological torture for the condemned person who was forced to witness the destruction of his own body while still alive. The quartering that concluded the execution involved dismembering the body into 5 parts, 4 limbs, and the torso, which were then displayed in different locations throughout London as permanent warnings to potential traitors. The head was typically placed on a spike at London Bridge, where it would remain visible to all river traffic for months or years until weather and scavengers finally destroyed it completely. The economic aspects of execution spectacles reveal just how thoroughly medieval authorities had commercialized death and suffering. Scaffold construction provided employment for carpenters and laborers. Food vendors sold refreshments to crowds who might spend entire days watching executions. Entrepreneurs rented viewing platforms and seating areas to spectators willing to pay premium prices for better views. Souvenir sellers offered everything from alleged pieces of the scaffold to vials claimed to contain the condemned person's blood. The social functions of execution spectacles extended far beyond entertainment to include community bonding, moral education, and political indoctrination. Attending executions was considered a civic duty that demonstrated loyalty to crown and church while providing opportunities for neighbors to gather and reinforce shared values through collective participation in sanctioned violence. These events created temporary communities united by bloodlust and righteous anger. Children's attendance at executions was not only permitted, but encouraged as an essential component of moral education. Parents brought their offspring to witness the consequences of sin and rebellion, using the condemned person's suffering as teaching tools about obedience, piety, and respect for authority. Some schools organized field trips to major executions, treating them as educational experiences equivalent to visiting cathedrals or libraries. The case of the mass execution of Anabaptists in Münster, Germany in 1536 demonstrates how execution spectacles could serve broader political and religious purposes beyond individual punishment. The 3 Anabaptist leaders who had led a religious rebellion were executed using specially designed torture methods that symbolically represented their theological errors while providing maximum entertainment for crowds that included representatives from across the Holy Roman Empire. The breaking wheel represents perhaps the pinnacle of this technical sophistication, combining mechanical ingenuity with anatomical knowledge to create deaths that could be calibrated with scientific. Several doctors attended major wheel executions to observe and document the effects of systematic bone breaking on the human body, creating detailed medical records that read like clinical studies of torture effectiveness. Medical observations from breaking wheel executions. Renaissance physicians documented that victims typically remain conscious for 6-12 hours after wheel breaking, depending on the extent of internal injuries and environmental conditions. Death usually resulted from a combination of shock, internal bleeding, exposure, and dehydration rather than any single catastrophic injury. The human body's remarkable capacity to survive extreme trauma while remaining conscious made breaking wheel punishment one of the most prolonged forms of execution available to medieval authorities. Different European regions developed variations on basic wheel construction and breaking techniques that reflected local preferences and cultural values. German wheels tended to be larger and more elaborately constructed, suitable for extended public displays that could last several days. French wheels were often smaller and designed for more efficient braking that prioritized spectacle over prolonged suffering. Italian wheels sometimes incorporated mechanical features that allowed for rotation during the braking process, adding visual drama to the punishment. The professional culture surrounding breaking wheel execution created networks of specialized craftsmen who shared techniques and innovations, much like other medieval guilds. Master executioners corresponded with colleagues in different cities, exchanging information about new braking techniques, wheel construction improvements, and crowd management strategies. Some executioners developed signature methods that became famous across Europe, drawing audiences who traveled specifically to witness particular masters at work. The case of Master Catherine Haussmann, one of the few female executioners in medieval Europe, demonstrates how breaking wheel expertise could transcend gender boundaries when technical skill was sufficiently developed. Haussmann operated in Bavaria from 1547 to 1563, performing over 40 wheel executions with a precision that earned her reputation throughout the German territories. Her innovations in rope positioning and braking sequences influenced executioner practices for generations. From a letter by Master Catherine Haussmann to her apprentice, 1559. Remember that the wheel requires patience above all virtues. Rushed braking produces quick death and disappointed crowds. Proper technique creates symphony of suffering that builds to crescendo over hours, not minutes. Each bone must be considered individually, its size, its position, its contribution to the victim's mobility and pain. We are not destroyers, but artists, creating masterworks of justice that will be remembered long after the bones have crumbled to dust. The psychological impact of breaking wheel punishment extended far beyond the immediate victim to affect entire communities that witnessed these spectacles. The combination of extreme physical suffering, prolonged dying process, and public display created collective trauma that could influence behavior for generations. Communities that hosted major wheel executions often experienced lasting changes in crime rates, social dynamics, and attitudes toward authority. The breaking wheel also served important legal functions beyond simple punishment. In cases where guilt was disputed or evidence was ambiguous, the victim's behavior during wheel breaking was interpreted as divine judgment about their innocence or guilt. Victims who died quickly were sometimes posthumously declared innocent, while those who survived longer were viewed as receiving proportionate punishment for their crimes. This theological interpretation transformed execution into a form of trial by ordeal. March 25, 1586, York, England. The morning mist clings to the cobblestones as Margaret Clitheroe, a 33-year-old mother of three, is dragged from her cell toward what will become one of the most documented and horrifying executions in English legal history. But Margaret doesn't know that in exactly 15 minutes, she will experience a death so brutal that even the hardened executioner will vomit before it's over. She doesn't know that her ribs will crack one by one like branches snapping in a winter storm. She doesn't know that her lungs will slowly collapse as 800 pounds of stone systematically crushes every bone in her chest. And she certainly doesn't know that 437 years later, we would still be talking about her scream. Dr. William Harrison, the court physician forced to monitor Margaret's vital signs during her execution, later wrote in his private journal, "The prisoner remained conscious for the entirety of the pressing. Her eyes bulged from their sockets as the weight increased. Blood frothed from her mouth by the 7th minute. By the 10th minute, I could hear her ribs snapping like dry kindling. She attempted to speak until the 13th minute, when her chest cavity could no longer expand enough to draw breath. Death came at the 15th minute and 37 seconds, not from the crushing weight, but from drowning in her own blood. Margaret Clitheroe's crime: hiding Catholic priests in her home during the Protestant Reformation. Her punishment: peine forte à dur, being pressed to death under increasing weights until she either confessed her guilt or died. The English legal system had calculated that this method would extract confessions from the most stubborn defendants. What they hadn't calculated was that some people would choose an agonizing death over betraying their faith. But here's what makes Margaret's execution truly shocking. It wasn't unusual. In the 16th century, this was just Tuesday. Across Europe, an estimated 100,000 people were executed between 1500 and 1600 using methods so horrific that modern forensic experts struggled to understand how the human body could endure such systematic destruction. We're talking about an era where torture wasn't just legal, it was profitable. Executioners charged different rates for different methods. A quick beheading cost more than a slow burning. A clean hanging was premium pricing compared to being drawn and quartered. What you're about to learn isn't just history, it's a journey into the darkest capabilities of human cruelty. Over the next 90 minutes, I'm going to reveal torture methods so sophisticated that they required engineering degrees to construct, so psychologically devastating that they broke minds before bodies, and so publicly celebrated that entire families would travel for days to witness them. You think you know about medieval brutality from movies and television? You know nothing. Hollywood actually sanitizes these historical realities because the truth is disturbing for mainstream audiences. The real methods were worse, much worse than anything Hollywood has dared to show. We're talking about punishments that could keep someone conscious and screaming for days, techniques that turned human execution into theatrical performances, and torture devices so intricate they were considered works of art. I'm going to show you the breaking wheel that could stretch a person's death across 4 days of public agony. I'll reveal the Spanish water torture that made prisoners beg to be burned alive instead. You'll learn about the Iron Maiden that wasn't designed to kill quickly, but to pierce victims at precisely calculated. March 25, 1586, York, England. The morning mist clings to the cobblestones as Margaret Clitheroe, a 33-year-old mother of 3, is dragged from her cell toward what will become one of the most documented and horrifying executions in English legal history. But Margaret doesn't know that in exactly 15 minutes, she will experience a death so brutal that even the hardened executioner will vomit before it's over. She doesn't know that her ribs will crack one by one like branches snapping in a winter storm. She doesn't know that her lungs will slowly collapse as 800 pounds of stone systematically crushes every bone in her chest. And she certainly doesn't know that 437 years later, we would still be talking about her scream. Dr. William Harrison, the court physician forced to monitor Margaret's vital signs during her execution, later wrote in his private journal, "The prisoner remained conscious for the entirety of the pressing. Her eyes bulged from their sockets as the weight increased. Blood frothed from her mouth by the 7th minute. By the 10th minute, I could hear her ribs snapping like dry kindling. She attempted to speak until the 13th minute, when her chest cavity could no longer expand enough to draw breath. Death came at the 15th minute and 37 seconds, not from the crushing weight, but from drowning in her own blood. Margaret Clitheroe's crime: hiding Catholic priests in her home during the Protestant Reformation. Her punishment, peine forte à dure, being pressed to death under increasing weights until she either confessed her guilt or died. The English legal system had calculated that this method would extract confessions from the most stubborn defendants. What they hadn't calculated was that some people would choose an agonizing death over betraying their faith. But here's what makes Margaret's execution truly shocking. It wasn't unusual. In the 16th century, this was just Tuesday. Across Europe, an estimated 100,000 people were executed between 1500 and 1600 using methods so horrific that modern forensic experts struggled to understand how the human body could endure such systematic destruction. We're talking about an era where torture wasn't just legal, it was profitable. Executioners charged different rates for different methods. A quick beheading cost more than a slow burning. A clean hanging was premium pricing compared to being drawn and quartered. What you're about to learn isn't just history, it's a journey into the darkest capabilities of human cruelty. Over the next 90 minutes, I'm going to reveal torture methods so sophisticated that they required engineering degrees to construct, so psychologically devastating that they broke minds before bodies, and so publicly celebrated that entire families would travel for days to witness them. You think you know about medieval brutality from movies and television? You know nothing. Hollywood actually sanitizes these historical realities because the truth is disturbing for mainstream audiences. The real methods were worse, much worse than anything Hollywood has dared to show. We're talking about punishments that could keep someone conscious and screaming for days, techniques that turned human execution into theatrical performances, and torture devices so intricate they were considered works of art. I'm going to show you the breaking wheel that could stretch a person's death across 4 days of public agony. I'll reveal the Spanish water torture that made prisoners beg to be burned alive instead. You'll learn about the Iron Maiden that wasn't designed to kill quickly, but to pierce victims at precisely calculated